Welcome to the second day of our conference on mapping the field of Jewish-Christian relations. For those of you who are online, I'm Ruth Langer. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning and a Professor of Jewish Studies in the Theology Department here at Boston College. It's my pleasure to be chairing this session on modes of reasoning, theology, and religious law. We've had a change in the order of the speakers by the speaker's request, and so the first speaker will be Kendall Soulen of Emory University. The Reverend Dr. R. Kendall Soulen is the Bishop Mack B. and Rose Y. Stokes Professor of Systematic Theology in Emory's Candler School of Theology. He's devoted much of his scholarship to showing that Christian faith becomes more authentically Christian as it overcomes its stubborn legacy of anti-Judaism. I invite Kendall to start.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Dan and Camille for the opportunity to participate in this very interesting conference, and I've been stimulated by the papers so far, and I look forward to our discussion today. So the particular task set before me and Randi is to map the field of Jewish-Christian relations from the point of view of theology and models of religious thought. So as I think about that assignment, what I reflect upon is the fact that fields of inquiry, generally presuppose certain conditions, require certain conditions. Those conditions include a common object of investigation, common methods, common authorities, and common criteria of validity. And it seems to me that in the case of what we might call the theology of Jewish-Christian relations, these conditions simply don't exist, or they don't exist very robustly among Christians and Jews. Why is this the case? Well, we've already observed some of it in our discussion yesterday. There are very deep, profound asymmetries that characterize the relationship between Jewish and Christian communities. These asymmetries are well known, but it's worth naming some of them. They're global demographics, the sheer size of the community, the distributions around the globe, relationships to power. Since the foundation of the State of Israel, some of these asymmetries have been rebalanced, but even so they remain. The future of Christianity, for example, is not tied to the future of any single nation state in the same way that the future of the Jewish people is tied to the State of Israel. But in addition to these demographic asymmetries, it seems to me there's a more fundamental asymmetry that concerns the theological identity of the two communities. And that concerns the fundamental shape of the canon and the presence or absence of an internal reference to the other community. The shape of the Christian canon is simply such that it involves Christian communities in an internal reference that becomes also an external reference to the Jewish people in a way that does not have any clear counterpart on the way in which Jewish community and its relationship to the canon has an internal and external relationship to the Christian community. As was observed yesterday, the native distinction in Jewish traditions between Israel and the nations, between Jew and Gentile, and not between Christians and Jews. This is a very deep-going structural asymmetry in the nature of the relationship. And I think it accounts for why it's difficult to talk about a common object of investigation, common methods, common authorities, common criteria of validity. I think it's also asymmetry that helps explain some features of Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Christian dialogue that repeatedly occur, at least in my experience. And that is a kind of a family of irritations that repeatedly present themselves. The Christian relationship to the Jewish partner is frequently experienced as encompassing, embracing, treading on personal space. And we had an observance about that yesterday where Sarah observed that she felt fetishized in some instances in the course of pursuing her work as a Jewish theologian of the New Testament. It seems to me that the nature of the relationship, however, is such that while we can become aware of these irritations and we can manage them to some degree, we probably cannot eliminate them entirely, short of the two communities, one or the other, changing their spots. So if we can't map a common field of inquiry, what shall we do? Well, we can still map the field as it presents itself to one of the conversation partners. So this is a more humble kind of map that is a map of how the field presents itself from a Christian point of view. And it is left to the other party, to the Jewish conversation partner, to map how the field looks like from their point of view. Even so, even with that modification, it seems to me, the task of trying to map the field of the theology of Jewish-Christian relations remains extremely challenging from a Christian point of view, and that is simply because of the vast internal variation and variety of Christian theological approaches to the issue. And once again, a certain degree of modesty of expectation, it seems to me, is highly appropriate. So in this case, I'm going to propose that what's most useful frequently is not the attempt to delineate a map, but to suggest the task can be advanced by providing a description of the cartographer. How do we map the cartographer? Who is the person doing the mapping? And what vectors do we need in order to identify their location in theological space? As Marianne pointed out yesterday, maps are in some sense always proposal that reflect the normative commitments and perspective of the person who's doing the mapping. So let's cut to the chase and let's examine some of the features that shape the theological perspective of the cartographer from the Christian point of view. Well, first of all, we would want to locate positions in terms of confessional affiliation. Historically, those have been in the Jewish-Christian relations Protestant and Catholic of European and European diaspora orientations. It's well both to acknowledge who's represented, what confessional orientations are represented, and also which are at the margins. In recent years, Orthodox participants have begun to come forward and have also begun to take part in this conversation. The Society of Post-Supersessionist Theology that I'm involved with recently had a session that featured Christian theologies of the Jewish people from Orthodox perspectives. That still leaves out a lot of churches native to the Middle East, Eastern Rite Catholic, Coptic, Syriac, and so on. So in proposing a cartographer, plotting the cartographer's place in space, we're frequently talking about a particular range of confessional dispositions. In the Protestant family, it's important to recognize the voices are not only those mainstream voices that are reflected in this gathering, but frequently in the United States, dispensationalist voices as well. In addition to confessional orientation, there are, it seems to me, historical reference points that need to be, that it's well to take into account. One of the peculiarities or special features of Jewish-Christian relations is that among fields of Christian theology, it seems to me to a remarkable degree, it's shaped not only by a relationship, but by the historical events that have been determinative for that relationship. The Holocaust, the foundation of the State of Israel, the emergence of new doctrinal teaching with Vatican II. So in plotting a person's location in theological space, confessional identity, but also what are the historical events that they have primarily in view as they go about doing their theological work? Is it principally with respect to the destruction of European Jewry, with respect to the emergence of a new state, of the Jewish people, with respect to subsequent struggles over the land, Palestinian displacement, and most recently, is it with respect to larger questions about the emergence of racism, colonialism in the modern period? These reference points of historical bodies of events that are fall within the purview of the theological reflection are frequently central and ingredient, but not all at the same time. Theologians select among them and focus on different ones. A third feature of locating perspectives in theological space. This is what I think we could call a historical trajectory. Let's focus for the moment on the primary actors in the European and European diaspora, Protestant and Catholic voices since the Shoah. In the development since 1948 and the initial responses of churches to the destruction of European Jewry, I think we can distinguish three stages in the evolution of a theological response. And I'm going to give rough and ready characterizations of those three stages. An initial stage is, I would say, runs from the first decade, 1948, into past the Second Vatican Council, the mid-60s. And I would characterize this as an initial identification of injury and an initial prescription for repair. So you could almost compare it to the triage that is done immediately after an accident. An immediate assessment of the wound and an immediate effort to respond to the crisis of the wound. The extraordinary achievement of Vatican II, I think, remains the extraordinary power of that achievement, I think, is attested by its continued relevance even to the present day. Nevertheless, that initial stage of identification of injury and prescription of repair seems to me was followed in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, but by what I think we could call a stage of lamentation, denunciation, and experimentation. And by those terms, what I want to indicate is a sense of pained outrage that the initial identification of the injury was not adequate to the depth of the injury that had been inflicted. and that the prescribed repairs, such as the teaching that Jews were not directly responsible for the crucifixion, that the repairs were not adequate to the depth of the injury. And in that same period of time, names such I associate with figures like Rosemary Ruther, the Eckharts, Paul Van Buren, go on record in arguing that the Christian church's reevaluation of its historic teaching needs to be on a much larger scale than had been attempted at Vatican II. So Rosemary Ruther spoke about anti-Semitism as the left hand of Christology, and they were wedded in a way that was deeply, frankly, inseparable. Historic Christology could not be resuscitated without simultaneously resuscitating anti-Semitism. Paul Van Buren, a student of Karl Barth, argued that the church had to yield its claim to the universality of the saving significance of Jesus Christ. The Eckharts went on record arguing that the key fault of the Christian tradition was the proclamation of the resurrection. So those diagnoses corresponded to a amplification of the depth of the injury that the Christian tradition had inflicted on the Jewish people, and the degree to which that distortion in Christian tradition was baked into the bones. A third stage, it seems to me, has been emerging over the last couple of decades. And I would characterize this third stage as a chastened recommitment to repair and a rededication to the simultaneous affirmation of the historic claims of the Christian tradition, and also a deep and thoroughgoing attempt to address and expunge the roots of anti-Judaism. So it's a both-and operation. And a very important articulation of this third stage we find in the work of Peter Oakes and his book, Another Reformation. And there Peter affirmed, there is a way for Christians to rededicate themselves to the gospel message and to classical patristic doctrines of the church without at the same time revisiting classical Christian supersessionism. And that announcement of a program he fleshes out by examining the work of a number of Christian scholars, Robert Jensen, George Limbeck, Dan Hardy, and others. And in the spirit of locating the cartographer in theological space, let me say that that's where I would locate myself in that third group. So what's the relevance of these three? It seems to me they're not entirely sequential. They are a sequence of sorts, but they also represent features of Christian thought that recur over time. Different communities are discovering the initial injury and proposing initial repair. Different parts of the large Christian family are entering the first stage at different times. The second stage of lamentation, denunciation, experimentation remains a living dimension of Christian response to the relationship in response to new historical events. So that second stage is, it seems to me, where we find ourselves for many Christians as we confront contemporary crisis in the Middle East and in Israel-Palestine. Thank you. So the three different modes I anticipate remaining features of our theological landscape for good into the future, for the simple reason that the historical events that confront us and that are engaged by theological reasoning continue to unfold. Let me turn finally to one final feature of theological space in which it's possible to locate our identities. And this last feature of theological space, it seems to me, concerns the model of the logic of dialogue that is being conducted. If you look at the program for this event, you'll notice that different sessions bear two different kinds of titles. On our very front of the event, we have Mapping the Field of Jewish-Christian Relations. When we open it up, in session 1, we again meet Jewish-Christian relations. In session 2, we meet Christian-Jewish relations. In session 4, however, we read Christian-Jewish dialogue. And in session 5, we read Christian-Jewish dialogue. That distinction between Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Christian dialogue, it seems to me, is a very significant one that's worth spending a little bit of time pondering. Because underneath them, they reflect two different models of what sort of a logic of dialogue is at place, what sort of logic of reasoning, theological reasoning, is at place. Let's begin with Christian-Jewish dialogue. And we can give the logic here the shorthand characterization of I, thou. The fundamental logic of a dialogue is I and thou. The meeting of two different partners in which each partner is employing the first person and the second person. I and you. And the conditions that enable dialogue are frequently identified as the search for parity, for symmetry, for equal access to the conversation space in which neither party is privileged and in which both parties are free to affirm their identities in ways that are both open to and questioned by the other tradition. Jewish-Christian relations, on the other hand, is a larger category which encompasses Jewish-Christian dialogue potentially, but actually includes a much larger space within which other sorts of reasoning can take place. And that other source of reasoning that can take place in Jewish-Christian relations includes what we can call us-them reasoning. Us-them reasoning is structured differently, in which the audience that participates in a given discussion is, in the first instance, us, intramural, a group of Christians, a group of Roman Catholics, a group of Lutherans, a group of evangelical dispensationalists, and in which Jews, the other figure not as a you, but as a them, in which the speech is about that other party in the third person. The conditions that support us-them reasoning are very different than the conditions that support I-thou reasoning. Those conditions require the privileging of one community over the other. They require a willingness to allow the authority of one community to be operative. They require frequently a necessity of coming to certain decisions or resolving certain problems. When a community meets as a group in order to discuss different community, there's frequently an item on the agenda that needs to be addressed by the time the meeting ends. Whereas in I-thou dialogue, the possibility of saying, see you next time, and not resolving anything is always a living option. In fact, it's often the preferred option to simply leave things indefinitely unresolved. I've taken time to elaborate these two because it seems to me their distinction is very fundamental to the nature of the enterprise we're involved in. And yet the difference of those two logics is not always, it seems to me, adequately surfaced. Christian theologians take different positions with regard to the value of those two different logics. There are theologians who embrace an us-them pattern with more or less indifference to any role for an I-thou pattern. Karl Barth, for all of his virtues and his ability to push Christian imagination forward, was largely an us-them theologian. On the other hand, there are Christian theologians that are so deeply committed to the I-thou model that there's resistance to ever permitting the conditions in which us-them reasoning can take place. Us-them reasoning always involves the willingness to privilege the Christian tradition and to ask, what should the church, qua church, teach on a given set of issues? My own view, and here again I'll locate myself in theological space, is that the two models of reasoning are actually both deeply valuable and actually indispensable to the health of the other. And that the long-term health of Jewish-Christian relations includes finding ways to cultivate both. The accomplishment of Nostra Aetate was largely an us-them accomplishment. It was preceded by I-thou dialogues between Jules Isaacs and others, and it laid the groundwork for future I-thou relationships. But the conference itself was a us-them enterprise in which Catholic doctrine was answerable primarily to Catholic doctrine and a Catholic audience. A model of doing both and integrating them both while identifying their distinction, this is not a Christian model, but it's one that I participated in as a Christian, is the statement of De Bru Amet of several years ago, which was a effort to articulate what Christianity looks like in Jewish terms. And the volume that accompanied that statement had a couple of interesting features. First, it was connected with the promulgation of a public statement written exclusively by Jews and addressed primarily to Jews about Christians as a third party. So it was an us-them document. At the same time, the book that accompanied that invited Christians to participate in conversation with Jewish writers on the various topics that were addressed. The possibility of occupying one of the wings or the other, Joseph Soloveitchik famously affirmed us-them without a willingness to engage in I-thou dialogue. Many folks wish to embrace I-thou, almost to, it seems to me, to a point where us-them reasoning is perceived as intrinsically problematic. My own proposal, insofar as cartographers are also proposing a way of looking at maps, is to say that both of these models are indispensable, and in the long run, each of them requires the other. In my own work, that's reflected in the fact that many of my publications have been primarily addressed to a Christian audience about how Christians should read the Bible. They're not efforts to persuade Jews of anything at all. On the other hand, the work has been deeply nourished by ongoing conversation with Jewish theological conversation partners, including, to my great benefit, many years of conversation with Michael Wyshegrod. So to conclude, going forward, I would encourage our maps of Jewish-Christian relations from a Christian point of view to make room for both of those dialogical logics. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. We now have a break that's scheduled to go until 10 o'clock, and particularly for the sake of people online, I think we're going to keep to that. So we'll have a break for 25 minutes or so before moving on to the next paper.
Could we take this time for questions specifically to Kendall and then have the schedule break?
Do you want to take a few questions? Should we take a few questions for Kendall?
Yeah,
For 5 minutes, a few questions. David, do you have one? Wait for the microphone.
Thank you, first of all. I want to make sure that I understood. You seem to be making several different points. So I'm going to summarize them really briefly, and I want your take on what I'm missing in these summaries. Point one, the field of Jewish-Christian relations does not exist and cannot exist as a field that encompasses both Jews and Christians, because Judaism and Christianity are fundamentally different and have different premises, and so we need to talk about a Christian field of Christian-Jewish relations and a Jewish field of Christian-Jewish relations, which should be in dialogue, but they're separate fields. That was the...
I'm sorry, what?
Which should be in dialogue, but they're separate fields. That was the first point I heard you say. The second point I heard you say was about the Christian field of Christian-Jewish relations, in which I think you laid out three options. We as Christians will acknowledge that something went wrong, but we're not going to change very much of anything. We as Christians need to fundamentally rechange everything because the damage is too deep to be navigated around. And the third group of, no, we can actually continue to do meaningful Christian theology in a traditional sense while fundamentally changing things, right? It's a middle ground between the minimal and the maximal. Then you pivoted in your final section to the question of us, them, and I, thou. I really liked the ways in which you're using those terms. I've used them in different ways. This was really helpful to me to think about. I think your message is we need I, thou dialogue to think with, but all the real work happens in the us, them, which is to say, back to your first point, the Jewish-Christian engagement is simply preparatory to Christian work on Jewish-Christian relations on the one hand and Jewish work on Jewish-Christian relations on the other, and the twain shall be in conversation, but they're never going to really meet.
Well, I'd say the second summary was pretty accurate. I would differ with the first and the third. The point I'm making specifically is that when you're trying to map the theology, and the emphasis is on the word theology of Jewish-Christian relations, yes, there is not a common theology that the two communities share. And so there's not common authorities. They're not a common criteria. It is true that both engage in theology. It is true that there's overlapping objects, etc. But at the end of the day, the two canons differ, the confessions differ, and so there's not that common object. So if you're trying to map historiography, you could say, yes, that's possible because there's a common history to some degree. I'm not going to judge that question. But in the case of theology, no, that's illusory. That's fundamentally illusory. The relationship's not illusory. Theological conversation's not illusory. But the notion that both parties occupy the same theological space is illusory. And what can take that place of that, it seems to me, is a clear-eyed assessment of what the asymmetry is. And I tried to sketch the nature of the asymmetry. That asymmetry is so fundamental to the anatomy of the relationship that unless it's named and acknowledged, it seems to me you're bound to go wrong. Now, yes, and that's why both us, them, and I, thou conversation and logics, it seems to me, is fundamental to the health of the field. Because there is no us in the most comprehensive of both Jews and Christians that is sufficiently thick to address the questions that concern us. When push comes to shove, the two communities are going to have to go intramural and make binding decisions for themselves. Catholics for Catholics, Protestants for Protestants, Jews for Jews. There may be circumstances that emerge where we discover ourselves able to speak with a common voice on certain issues, and we recognize a common authority. But I think what we'll call that is the kingdom of God. And in the meantime, what keeps those two? Clearly there are dangers with either logic becoming a monolith. The danger of the us-them is that you're only dealing with the hermeneutical other. You're dealing with a fictive other. The danger of the dominance of the I-thou model is that you no longer become accountable for your own in-group's authoritative teaching. Many people, you can participate in I-thou dialogue to the end of time without assuming responsibility for what the corporate body actually maintains. And nevertheless, it's in the us-them moment where a person re-enters their community and says, I shoulder responsibility for what we corporately say about them. And that's not something you can do in the I-thou environment. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Avi.
And I apologize for my voice. I am just dry as a rock. But I have no idea why. And I'm slurping water, but it's not helping.
I think you've still been managed to express what you wanted to express, though.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I really appreciate the candor with which you're speaking, and things should be as hard as they actually are. If I understand correctly, I'm not sure I agree from the Jewish side. We have the notion of Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach and Chasidei Omot Olam, which very much are and have been appropriated as a theology of Christianity. That is to say, to translate the 7 commandments of the children of Noah, which is a characterization of non-Jews and their status, as well as the righteous of the nations. So could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, so I'm not saying that Jews can't have a theology of Christianity. By no means. I simply said, I'm not going to do that. That's not something I can do. But that it exists on the Jewish side, absolutely.
Does it exist on the Christian side in the other direction?
Yes. So yeah. So it's very much my hope and belief that the Christian community can articulate a very constructive Christian theology of Judaism. But in order for that to have a lifespan, a hope of long-term endurance, It really has to be a Christian theology of Judaism. Otherwise, its sell-by date is going to come very quickly. And that was the problem with that second generation, the middle period, where the bold proposals were made. They were very bold proposals, but they had a short lifespan. Why? Because they could not sustain themselves within the intramural community. Judaism certainly has powerful theologies of Christian community. They have to be Jewish theologies. And so what was very impactful for me as a Christian theologian was encountering the work of Michael Wishograd, very unapologetic Jewish theology. It wasn't actually, this is an interesting point, it was him writing in an us-them mode that was really impactful on me. In other words, when he was talking about me as a Christian in the third person, and where he was saying us Jews and them guys, because that permitted me to see myself in a way that I couldn't see from Christian authors. But it was the deeply self-avowed Jewish character of his work that created that potential. And neither community can do that for the other. Now, what's very fascinating is we have a whole lot of people who want to do it in various forms of partnership, but that remains partnership. Yeah.
So I think we're going to cut this off at this point. I just want to have one little observation, that one of the models that we've been working on in some of our national, international level working groups has been that of having auditors in the room. And that creates a degree of honesty in the conversation sometimes also. So we can be working on a Christian topic, have one or two Jews in the room, socially part of the group, even intellectually part of the group, but the group's focus is on a Christian topic, or the reverse can also be true. All right, welcome back to the second half of this session. And it's my pleasure now, it's always a sign of a good conference when people are enjoying talking with each other so much that they don't want to come sit down. We now invite Randi Rashkover to continue this discussion of theology, mapping modes of reasoning, theology, and religious law. Randi is the Gumenick Professor of Jewish Studies, Professor of Religious Studies, and Director of Judaic Studies at William and Mary. She's the author of a number of books, as is almost everybody here in the room, so I will not read them off. Yeah, so Randi, the floor is yours.
There's no stool.
There is no stool.
I just don't want to look ridiculous in front of this. I don't know. It depends how ridiculous I look. Do I look? I don't look ridiculous? Okay. Okay, so, oh dear. So this will be a follow-up and a response to Kendall's paper. Kendall and I have been in conversation for many years. So it's also going to be a little philosophically tough going. So it's like when the pilot says, you know, there probably will be some turbulence, and that funny thing under your seat probably isn't going to help you at all. So, okay, so it's lovely to be here for the event. Thank you so much to Dan for inviting us. Dan had asked Kendall and I to offer an account of different modes of reasoning that have been deployed in Jewish Christian thought. Originally, I considered presenting a taxonomy of reasoning patterns as they appear throughout the Jewish tradition, but then I thought it would be more effective to identify the reasoning patterns that appear in the most recent work in Jewish Christian thought and assess these patterns and their relation to one another. So in Kendall's description, I'm going to be investigating what he considered to be this third moment of when we're, anyway, I won't revisit it, but it's why, but I'm going to philosophically interrogate it. It's widely recognized that a new chapter in Jewish-Christian theological relations emerged in the wake of the Holocaust and Vatican II. However, These developments have frequently been accompanied by an anxiety over what is perceived to be a tension between Jewish-Christian exchange and the stability of each tradition. A classic statement of this anxiety appears in, here's my Dr. Potter, and I really do love him, but appears in David Novak's article, Supersessionism, Hard and Soft, published in First Things in 2019. By supersessionism, Novak does not simply refer to the Christian notion that the Christian church has superseded the Jewish people, assuming their role as God's covenanted people, Israel, but Novak refers to the broader philosophical notion that one tradition holds absolute truth claims that invalidate the other. For example, Novak argues that while Christian supersessionism does involve the overcoming and invalidation of an old idea by a new one, Jewish criticisms of Christianity as pagan or polytheistic are also, quote, supersessionist, even if they point to a theological sequence rather than a temporal one, unquote. Nonetheless, Novak maintains that there are two forms of supersessionism. The first he calls hard supersessionism, which consists of external attempts to convert Jews by Christians, or to Jewish indifference or outright dismissal of Christianity as a form of paganism. The second he labels soft supersessionism, which refers to modes of Jewish or Christian engagement with the other that maintain confidence in the unique and unrivaled truth of each tradition's respective revelation and accompanying norms, but identify theological conditions that permit or encourage positive engagement or dialogue with the other. For example, the Christian appeal to the Pauline notion of God's eschatological treatment of the Jews maintains the absolute theological difference between Judaism and the Christian message, but opens possibilities for Christians to, quote, let Jesus take the wheel, if you will, when it comes to Jews, such that contemporary Christians need not actively pursue Jewish conversion. Most significantly, if you missed that and you missed the distinction between hard and supersessionism, just keep listening, you'll hear the music. Most significantly, Novak rejects hard supersessionism, but he accepts forms of soft supersessionism. Both Christians and Jews should, he argues, reject forms of hard supersessionism. Why? Because we live in times when Jews and Christians need to combine their forces in the fight against secularism. Christians should no longer seek to missionize Jews, and Jews should recognize Christians as monotheists and allies in their attempt to, quote, confront a common enemy, militant secularism, unquote. Indeed, Novak suggests it's this practical endeavor, coupled with an appreciation of a range of common moral norms, natural law, that constitutes for Novak the heart of Jewish-Christian relations. If, however, Novak promotes Jewish dialogue for the purpose of appreciating shared natural law on the one hand and combating secularism, he also insists that such a relation does not, and indeed should not, threaten either tradition's right to maintain the absolute validity of their revelatory tradition over and against the other. That is to say, if he endorses a soft supersessionism, it is still supersessionism on the philosophical grounds that I earlier identified it as operating for him. For Novak, even an active Jewish-Christian dialogue needs, in his view, to retain some degree of soft supersessionism, and here's his argument, since otherwise the absolute validity of each tradition's revelatory tradition is in question, and this is his key argument here, and therefore the ongoing motivation of its adherents is at risk. So Novak is arguing that we need to maintain a degree of supersessionism or a form of supersessionism. Otherwise, adherents won't have adequate reason to retain their commitment to their tradition. Here's a quote from the First Things article. A complete denial of supersessionism leaves Christians unable to affirm Christianity as having brought something new and fuller to the ancient covenant between God and Israel. Without some kind of supersessionism, Christians have, this is the important claim, no cogent reason for not going back to their Jewish origins. Without some kind of supersessionism on our part, Jews like me, he says, would have, again, no cogent reason for not going forward into what Christians regard as Judaism's fulfillment, unquote. Without maintenance of some appeal to the absolute validity of one's revelatory tradition, adherents engaged in Jewish-Christian encounters run the risk of undermining the grounds for their commitment to their own tradition. In other words, the continuity of the tradition is threatened. While he concedes that Judaism and Christianity both recognize the revelatory significance of the Hebrew Scriptures, they disagree regarding the normative interpretation of this text. And as he explains, these interpretations and the normative worldviews that they generate, quote, are not the kind of differences where it can be said, you have your truth and we have ours. Rather, they concern the ultimate level of truth corresponding to ultimate reality. They concern our relationship to God. Here, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is the starkest. It is a matter of either or. That is, either the Jewish people or the Christian church is the fullest, most complete location for the ultimate relationship, the final purpose for humans created in the image and likeness of God, unquote. So, a Jewish-Christian dialogue, according to Novak, that aspires to a complete dissolution of supersessionism inevitably works against the interests of each tradition, and thus a soft supersessionist position of some desirable sort constitutes a necessary condition of any Jewish-Christian engagement. To his credit, David recognizes that as human beings, our assertions concerning absolute truth are always qualified by God's eschatological prerogative. Even so, and ironically, Novak does not appeal to the ultimate eschatologically determined finitude of human assertions as his primary point of orientation for Jewish-Christian relations. Rather, as noted, he appeals to the contemporary battle between Judaism, Christianity, and secularism, and what is his insistence on their soft supersessionist position, both with regard to each other and equally important with their regard to the joint rejection of the foundational premises of modern secularism. Today, I want to offer an entirely different perspective on this model of reasoning. More specifically, I want to offer a review of this widely held position from an account of the perspective of the fallibility of our claims about our revealed traditions. From here, I will illuminate a picture of Jewish-Christian relations that offsets the assumptions and the anxiety in Novak's account. For our purposes, I want to offer two angles on the fallibility question. One is Peter Oakes's and one is mine, even though the two are very similar. Let's start with Peter's. In an article entitled Domains, Normativity, and Normativity Across Domains, Susanna Ticciati offers a description of Peter's account of scriptural revelation. Oakes, she says, quote, distinguishes in rabbinic terms, this is going to be this moment there, oh God, I just realized, there's the Woody Allen film, Annie Hall, and he's standing in line, and they're going to the film, and there's some idiot who's talking about the director of the movie, and then Woody Allen imagines that the director shows up and says to the idiot who was standing in line that Woody Allen just can't bear to hear anymore, I am so-and-so, and you know nothing of my work. This is probably going to happen here. Okay, so this is Susanna on Peter. Peter, she says, distinguishes in rabbinic terms between the will of the absolute. I mean, these are going to be some really beautiful quotes here. distinguishes in rabbinic terms between the will of the absolute, as displayed in the plain sense of Scripture, but only indeterminately, and the determinate meanings that are arrived at by historically specific communities of readers. For finite creatures, only the latter have truth values. In another Reformation, Peter clarifies, she says, quote, it's a great quote from Peter, "We may declare, we have heard directly from the one whose word is true universally, yes indeed, but we are not the ones to articulate the universality of this word," unquote. Here, Susanna uses the term indeterminate to describe Peter's account of how the will of the absolute is presented in scriptural revelation. Peter often uses the term vague. Scripture, Peter says, speaks vaguely, independently of any relationship to the listener. This is a quote from Peter. To speak vaguely, however, as in somebody in this room is smoking, is to claim that both speaker and listener are constrained by the facts of the case. In this case, by the character of whoever is smoking, or in the case of Scripture, Scripture's content. Vague claims thereby engage both speaker and listener in a binding two-way relationship. Something, somewhere, is what it is, and this is the key point, and we must both work to find out where it is. Thus, the expected response to a vague claim is to engage this speaker in a long series of questions, which may lead to a long series of conversations that would help both speaker and listener get closer to the intended object, which is to see it less vaguely, unquote. Again, if that's hard, hopefully you'll keep hearing the music. Stated otherwise, a vague concept is one whose full meaning is reliant on its determination across a range of possible contexts. Thus, as Ticciati indicates in Oakes's view, scriptural revelation is not a set of truth claims, but formally speaking, a condition of the possibility of the human determination of truth claims, in this case, truth claims generated through processes of scriptural exegesis and interpretation. As such, the wisdom of the text is not synonymous with the truth claims we formulate. The wisdom of the text is not synonymous with the truth claims that we formulate, but rather with the text's ability to foster our hermeneutical attempts to formulate them. Moreover, human determination of vague claims into truth-determinate claims is always a context-conditioned activity. As finite creatures, human beings develop assertoric propositions, determinations concerning what we take to be the case or not the case, about what we know within the limits of our finitude, our physical, historical, political, economic particularity and location. Thus, truth claims, or in this case, exegetical determinations of Scripture's contents, are features of human life and not features of scriptural revelation itself, and as such are inevitably finite or fallible. There's no such thing in Peter's account of an absolute truth claim, or at least, and I think the qualification here is better, not one that we as human beings can access or lay claim to. Absolute truth, to the extent that there is any, is simply not tantamount to our conception of and ways of handling what we call truth. Certainly, one might wonder why for Peter scriptural polyvalence registers as wisdom and not simply possibility. And this is an important point. The short answer is that scriptures are sources of wisdom when they serve as catalysts for habits of human flourishing, as these habits are constituted by the exegetical determination of vague claims into successful ways of life. So when a text is something that helps to foster exegetical determinations that help to flourish and help to sponsor the flourishing of human life, then the text becomes a source of wisdom and one that we will perpetually be drawn to. So in Religion Without Violence, Peter states that from an operational perspective, as a hypothesis emerging from the observation of social groups and their behaviors in normal times and crisis times, scriptural revelation is more akin to a hearth or what we might think of as, quote, what is most value in a religious group's beliefs and practices. In Peter's estimation, to speak of a scriptural tradition as sacred is to speak of how it operates as a catalyst for the human development of ways of life that promote human flourishing and work to repair human suffering. As such, Peter doesn't worry about threats to Judaism's continuity or Christianity's continuity. And this is not because, like Novak and others, he finds refuge in assertions of the absolute validity of revelation, but because he has confidence in the wisdom afforded by these traditions, as this wisdom is articulated in the form of living habits, both theoretical and practical, that promote human flourishing and repair human alienation in the created order. Note, and this is an important point, Peter's claims that truth claims concerning revelation are a human enterprise does not mean that revelation is non-propositional or beyond propositionality. Such a move would render Peter's view vulnerable to charges of what I call, in some of my other work, arbitrary anchoring, or an expression of an appeal to a more that is devoid of any humanly derived meaning. Peter's view is not that revelation is non-propositionalizable, but that it's only propositionalizable through finite human determinations. As promised, there's a second angle from which we can appreciate the fallibility of claims regarding revelatory traditions, and from which we may find relief for the kind of anxiety regarding Jewish relations that accompanies Novak's account. And this will be mine. As noted above, Novak presupposes that recourse to the absolute validity, supersessionism, of one's religious position is a necessary feature of Jewish-Christian engagement because without it, the engagement threatens to promote syncretism on the one hand or relativism on the other, when by relativism, Novak means the dissolution of the truth value of revelatory claims. As we have seen, Peter would suggest that this anxiety is misplaced. Both Oakes and I will maintain that neither Jews nor Christians have to fear the dissolution of supersessionism. Oakes maintains that revelatory traditions are simply not the kinds of things that one can be supersessionist about. I will claim that even if Peter is right, that they are not, human beings are fully capable of presenting them as such, and I will argue that such attempts to present revelatory traditions as the kinds of things that we can be supersessionists about are ideological efforts that are ultimately self-destructive for members of both traditions. So what I'm going to argue is contra Novak. If Novak argues that the appeal to absolute validity is a necessary condition of Jewish-Christian relations, I'm going to argue on the grounds that it's the only means by which adherents can retain their ongoing commitment to a particular tradition. I'm going to argue that that view actually results in the opposite, that retaining that kind of commitment to absolute validity is going to result in the discontinuity of a tradition, and that the way that actually to preserve continuity is to recognize the fallibility of our human determinations concerning revelation. I will claim, recognition of the fallibility of revelatory claims is, I will argue, a condition of the continuity of these traditions, such that what adherents should fear most is not the dissolution of supersessionism, but its retention in any form. The central contention of my analysis is the following philosophical claim. Claims must be fallible to be true. Claims must be fallible to be true. By this I mean that the determination of a claim as true is the determination of it as true. A true claim undergoes a test, or is a claim that's accompanied by an account of what makes it true. However, a claim that is true, insofar as it's accompanied by such an account, is conditionally true or fallible. While this may at first seem counterintuitive, it's not hard to see that the assertion of a claim as true without an account of what makes it true is vulnerable to the skeptic's charge, who asks something like maybe, how do you know that this is always the case? Or what is this X claim and how is it different from Y? In response to which, the respondent would have to provide an account to preserve the integrity of the claim. Minus such an account, the skeptic can justifiably accuse the claimant of irrationality or dogmatism or both. Thus, a true claim is only true and neither arbitrary nor dogmatic by virtue of its fallibility. When Novak argues in favor of supersessionism as a philosophical position, he argues in favor of the absolute validity of revelatory positions. Thus, by supersessionism, he can't, according to the category that I just offered, he can't actually mean to refer to the truth of the tradition, since such a position would permit the possibility of an argument for or against it. Rather, as noted above, Novak appeals to the absolute validity of this tradition, since he claims that without it, the Jew would have no reason to remain a Jew and the Christian no reason to remain a Christian. Apparently, Novak either A, does not want Jewish-Christian relations to be exercises in the advancement of strong reasons in favor of the truth or of one or the other's position, or, and I think in this case the latter is probably more the case, Novak does not see how Jewish-Christian relations could be such an exercise, in the sense that David can't imagine what kinds of reasons each might bring to the table. I.e., he doesn't think that the truth of a revelatory tradition is the kind of truth for which there could be reasons. In either case, he holds that only an appeal to the absolute validity, the untested, if you will, an unaccounted for validity of the revelatory tradition can secure its adherence. Thus, when Novak asserts the absolute validity of one's respective traditions, he takes the question of this validity off the table and instead suggests that the revelatory tradition is not only absolutely true, but the ground or the standard of what constitutes truth and falsehood at all. Well, Novak concedes that within this framework, and this is an important point, well, Novak concedes that within this framework, once you accept an absolute validity of your revelatory tradition, Novak's going to concede that reasoning can transpire within that. A tradition can, once adherents have accepted that absolute presupposition, a tradition can posit true and false claims and may foster internal arguments with regard to the truth and falsehood of particular claims. Novak's position implies that these true and false claims are fallible only in relation to one another and can only be critiqued by adherents who sustain a shared assumption regarding the absolute validity of the revelatory tradition and not by critics outside of this framework. While at first glance such a view may seem to resemble Peter's account of how religious tradition functions, it's different in one crucial respect. Novak's account, support of soft supersessionism, indicates that his revelatory tradition is absolutely valid, while Oakes maintains that scriptural revelations are not the kinds of things about which one can say they are true or not, since the language of truth is ours and is such always fallible. We cannot, my argument is, drop the fallibility condition whenever we choose to. Moreover, it's my argument that even if we could, such a position would be irrational or dogmatic and would ultimately threaten the continuity of the tradition rather than sustain it. My argument is that if proponents do sustain the absolute validity of their revelatory tradition, they are subject to the skeptic's challenge, and to the extent that they are subject to the skeptic's challenge, while maybe not in the short term, that the adherents will question their adherence to the tradition, but in the long term, dogmatism or irrationality does lead to the discontinuity and the loss of adherent respect for a tradition. To appreciate the philosophical problems associated with the appeals to the absolute validity of foundational claims, we can refer to none other than one of my often go-to people, Leo Strauss's analysis of the irrationality of the modern scientific position. In his preface to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, Leo Strauss argues that the Enlightenment's claim to monopolize truth vis-a-vis the success of natural science can be traced back to Spinoza's account of the human knowledge of nature and Spinoza's robust critique of revelation and miracles. However, Strauss argues that Spinoza's scientific denial of the possibility of miracles only succeeds if one takes for granted the exclusive logical validity of scientific knowledge. To be convincing, Spinoza's critique of miracles or revelation would need to, quote, depend on metaphysical support or on an account of how scientific knowledge alone adequately and absolutely refers to how things really are. Spinoza, however, doesn't provide such a metaphysical account, but merely assumes the self-evidence of naturalistic criteria. He permits his argument to rest on unargued premises and refuses to engage with the possible challenges to his position. What had been an account of the truth of natural science hereby degenerates into a dogmatic absolutism that neglects the skeptic's challenge and undermines its own claims to knowledge. In his 1935 published Philosophy and Law, Strauss attributes the same pattern to the modern Enlightenment more generally. There he argues that, like Spinoza, modern Enlightenment thinkers refuse to quarrel with orthodoxy because they insist that natural science's practical successes signal its absolute epistemic superiority to traditional claims of revelation. If, however, the Enlightenment's tendency toward epistemic absolutism had its modern roots in Spinoza, Strauss asserts a very controversial claim that it found its initial inspiration in Catholicism's identification between reason and revelation. Easily misunderstood, Strauss's critique of Thomistic scholasticism is not a call for an absolute severance between theology and reason, as perhaps secularization thesis theorists might presume. For Strauss, it's not the relation between reason and revelation that concerns Strauss, but the identification of the two as absolute that worries him, and which he thinks filters down to the modern Enlightenment. Like its scholastic forebear, the modern Enlightenment refuses, and this is the argument I'm making about Novak's move, it's the same logic. The modern Enlightenment refuses to recognize its own limits and refuses to concede the prospect of falsification. A willful rejection of the prospect of new information or data that might alter its account of truth, the Enlightenment position is, in Strauss's view, anti-scientific. Strauss argues that appeals to absolute validity that are unaccounted for is anti-scientific. And I agree with him. The very Enlightenment that touts natural science and modern reason undermines science and reason and introduces cracks in the foundations of civilization. So, from here, it's easy to recognize the negative consequences of the insistence on claims to absolute validity. If, as we have seen, appeals to absolute validity are attempts to shield foundational and internal claims from the potential falsifications that may emerge from encounters with the world and encounters with other accounts of the world, then appeals to absolute validity are attempts to ignore and thwart ongoing knowledge of the world and ongoing knowledge of other approaches to it. There are two primary negative entailments of such an approach. First, rather than secure the continuity of each tradition, the appeal to absolute validity destabilizes it. While I do not maintain that the intelligibility of revelatory claims constitutes, this is an important point, I'm not arguing that the intelligibility of revelatory claims constitutes the sole and exhaustive meaning of the worth of such claims. Revelatory claims can provide moral guidance, political structures, ontological knowledge. I do hold that the intelligibility or the ability to offer an account of how X claim makes sense in relation to other things we know about the world does constitute a minimal condition of the ongoing commitment to a tradition. While ideologues who often insist on the unfalsifiability of claims are skilled at deploying a robust range of tools to maintain adherent commitment to dogmatic or irrational claims, in the long run, ideologies lose their power when the contradictions and unintelligibility of their positions is exposed. when there's no way to distinguish between the absolute validity of a position and its fantastical character, adherents will likely question their commitment to said view and leave it in search of other worldviews and theoretical and practical habits more suited to the conditions of their life. Moreover, adherents do not need to maintain the absolute validity of their tradition to sustain commitment, and this is a huge point. From an Oaksian perspective, adherents' commitments to their traditions do not depend upon the particular truth claims they develop out of their, broadly speaking, exegetical work, but on the tradition's capacity to support this exegetical work by virtue of its polyvalent wisdom. Second, and perhaps an even more damaging entailment, and this is really when we talk about Jewish-Christian relations as a potential field of inquiry, this is the second negative consequence. Perhaps an even more damaging entailment of the irrationality of the appeal to absolute validity is its failure to help human beings develop the knowledge they need to solve human problems. By limiting what counts as legitimate knowledge to the field of revelatory knowledge or this closed system, such an approach or insistence on the absolute validity of revelatory frameworks prohibits the ongoing encounter with the world that can generate knowledge discourses that exceed the bounds of the finite and fixed account of truth and falsity. Thus, it inevitably alienates human beings from the world and the possibility of developing knowledge of the world that they need to promote human flourishing in and with the world. By contrast, an account of human knowledge development in the context of the philosophical pursuit of truth, by which I mean the ongoing encounter between human inquiry and the world, invites the work of a great multiplicity of worldviews or discourses and modes of inquiry in the service of human problem solving and not in the service of the endorsement of a hegemonic account of truth and falsity. In sum, the appreciation of the fallibility of human truth claims is necessary for the project of the pursuit of human flourishing in the world, and the appeal to absolute validity vis-a-vis a foundationalist or other claims obstructs it. Not only does the commitment to supersessionism secure the unintelligibility and ideological character of each respective tradition, it thwarts the human effort to reconcile itself with the world, or what is nothing other than the fulfillment of God's project for human beings within his created order. The above account of the fallibility of revelatory claims in hand, we can begin to sketch a different account of Jewish-Christian relations than the one presented in Novak's account of soft supersessionism. And here, I'm really going to give this is the last part of the paper, a really different account of what the whole purpose of Jewish-Christian intellectual exchange is at all. What it's really about. What should we be concerned? What are we concerned with? First, an account of Jewish-Christian relations in light of the fallibility of claims is an account that has nothing to do with supersessionism and is devoid of the latent antagonism or inclination to battle it out on the field of normative claims. Neither tradition arrives at the Jewish-Christian dialogue table fueled by a latent self-certainty, and thus neither need be threatened by the latent polemicism of the other tradition to the extent that you take for granted the fallibility of claims, which I'm telling you is a condition of the possibility of their being true or false at all. While Novak and others opt for versions of supersessionism and thereby hope to quell the tendencies by adherents to missionize or invalidate the other's position, Novak's insistence on retaining a supersessionist position guarantees that Jewish-Christian encounters maintain the conditions for these positions, even if they discourage adherents from materializing. By contrast, Jewish-Christian relationships that operate without these appeals to absolute validity are free of the rivalry and explicit or implicit impulse to assert the invalidity of the other position. Moreover, not only does an appreciation of the fallibility of Jewish-Christian claims eliminate the rivalrous and potentially deadly character of Jewish-Christian relations, even if we pretend it's not there, also has the potential to orient Jewish-Christian relations in an entirely new direction. The history of Jewish-Christian relations can be identified with three phases. 1, the adversarial. 2, the argumentative and apologetic. And 3, the pragmatic. The adversarial is well represented. Of course, the adversus Judaeus tradition on the Christian side, and then on the Jewish side, things like Rav Abraham Isaac Kook's thought. Phase 2 of the history of Jewish-Christian relations is what many call the argument apologetic phase, characterized by attempts to present the superiority of one's tradition on rational grounds. A good example of this is what we call the Kant-Mendelssohn debate, to determine which is more rational, Judaism or Christianity. What distinguishes this phase from phase 1 is admittedly the willingness in phase 2 to submit the assessment of the traditions to rational arbitration, even in the context of apologetic efforts designed to use reason to convince the other side of one's position. These are forms of that the Jewish-Christian relations have assumed in the past. As we have seen, while Novak's soft supersession modifies the violent tendencies of unabashed supersessionism, philosophically speaking, the position resembles phase 1 more than phase 2. The third phase, which is the one that I'm interested in, and which many of us are interested in, is what I'll call, and others will call, the pragmatic phase, which presupposes the fallibility of human claims concerning revelation on philosophical grounds. Indeed, in many respects, theologians in the first phase of Jewish-Christian relations are as concerned with this pragmatically inflected phase as they are with the argumentative apologetic phase, because they fear that it denies the absolute validity of their revelatory position. However, as indicated above, it's the central contention of this analysis that their fear is unwarranted, blah, blah, blah. So, it's also the contention of this analysis that unlike phase 2 or the stage of argument apologetics, the benefits of this third pragmatic phase vastly outweigh the negatives. This is because the pragmatic phase is an entailment of the principle of human flourishing that accompanies the account of the fallibility of claims offered above. As discussed, applied to religious traditions or any worldview, the principle of human flourishing, or the workability of claims, is the principle that for claims to retain value or worth over time, they must be intelligible or workable for those who hold them. When by workable, I mean they comport with other things that we know about the world, and they facilitate our ways of living in the world. This means at once their philosophical truth status is context dependent on the ongoing human inquiry into how things are, when how things are is a reflection of the cognitive habits human beings develop in relation to the world for the purpose of sustaining their adaptation to and flourishing within it. Seen from this perspective, truth, or even a notion of absolute truth, amounts only to the hypothetical and always deferred future notion of the sum of all collectively retained or pragmatically successful human cognitive habits. Such a conception of truth is not only indeterminate, vague, and always incomplete, but its primary function is regulative. By regulative, I mean it illuminates and can remind adherents of particular worldviews and proponents of particular scientific discourses of cognitive norms implicit in the pragmatic fallibility of claims. It illuminates the principle that fallibly held human claims are claims that human beings maintain when they support the human effort to adapt and sustain well-being in relation to the world as their primary environment, and not when they're deployed as anti-pragmatic declarations of the cognitive superiority alone. Thus, the key to the following analysis of this phase of Jewish-Christian relations is a recognition of the regulative impact of the notion of truth. That is to say, what I'm offering here is a notion of scientific truth where truth is only something, ultimate truth, absolute truth, is really only something that we can think about in terms of the sum total of human cognitive determinations over time, as those human cognitive determinations have been weaned by way of adequate aid for human flourishing. So ultimately, one has this notion, this kind of regulative notion of human flourishing in the world that serves as a motivation for ongoing investigation and inquiry when we're dealing with the fallibility of claims. So the key to the following analysis is a recognition of the regulative impact of this notion of truth, not its epistemic impact, and its accompanying account of worldviews and scientific discourses as actors in the ongoing pursuit of truth on the behavior of Jews and Christians engaged in their interreligious encounters. Arguably, the regulative impact of this notion of truth generates 3 stages of pragmatically motivated encounter between Judaism and Christianity. The first stage is pragmatically motivated encounters between one tradition and another. The first stage is pragmatically motivated encounters between one tradition and another, when adherents of one tradition recognize limits in their own tradition's ability to resolve, worldly problems. The second stage further develops a tradition's appreciation for the fruits of another discourse by requiring that one's tradition to maintain a minimal degree of compatibility with the full range of positive scientific and traditional discourses. And the third phase recognizes that minimal compatibility needs to morph into maximal support for traditions and discourses other than one's own when we collectively recognize the complex problems we all face and the shared responsibility we all have to collectively address them. So in the first phase that is an outgrowth of this regulative pragmatic approach is that a religious tradition is going to recognize, has the ability to recognize the limits of itself to deal with certain problems. So a good case study of this is in the Jewish tradition in the medieval period. You had Jews that were thinking about the relationship between Judaism and public law, and they began to appeal to Greek philosophy and non-Jewish philosophy because they recognized that Jewish halakha was limited with regard to certain kinds of problems. That's a very positive thing. It shows that there is an interest in appealing to discourses that are outside of Judaism for the sake of solving problems that are arguably internal to Judaism. But arguably, this kind of model can actually take Jewish discourse to recognize that it needs other discourses, not just to help solve its own problems, but it realizes that we as Jews have problems that are shared with everybody else. We live in a shared world. And so while Jews are in the business of trying to solve their own problems, often they're going to find that those problems are the same that other people have. And so they're going to probably begin to have an opportunity to recognize the problem-solving value of other traditions. Ultimately, ideally, the final phase is that Jewish communities from such a model can not only strive for compatibility with other traditions and discourses that contribute to human flourishing, but that Judaism should actively support them. Like all communities, Jews need this world to be inhabitable. This demand only increases as the world becomes a smaller place and generates what scholars call complex problems that are far-reaching and from which few communities can remain immune, and problems that are not adequately addressed by the application of one or two spheres of inquiry, but require a wide plurality of knowledge discourses to tackle. Applied to Jewish-Christian relations, this means that Jews and Christians need to work together to identify, be informed of, and help respond to complex problems. Moreover, it means that Jews and Christians ought to collaborate in support of societal institutions that endorse the pragmatic pursuit of truth and the health and vitality of the multiplicity of discourses required to engage in the work of complex human problem solving. In sum, an appreciation of the fallibility of revelatory claims in the context of the pursuit of human flourishing in a shared world catapults Jews and Christians into an entirely new normative environment, which invites them to understand how Jewish-Christian engagement need not be inhibited by an anxiety over the preservation of rivalrous positions. That's not to say that Jewish-Christian relations understood within this pragmatic context might not stimulate traditions to offer strong arguments. It does mean that a protectionist supersessionism need not have any bearing on the character of Jewish-Christian relations at all, nor should it be permitted to overshadow the development of a Jewish-Christian relation that can bring out the best of what each of these traditions has to offer to a suffering world.
Wow. Thoughts, questions? What? Sorry?
I told you there was going to be a lot of turbulence.
Kendall, would you like to respond to Randi?
I'm not sure. I think I'm going to hold off just a second and mull it and see if anybody else wants to dig in.
Catherine.
Thank you very much for this wild ride. It was very interesting to see these different perspectives. I'm still left sort of with the question of then what motivates people in their commitment to a particular religious tradition. So everything you say, I think, is indeed helpful in order to bring about dialogue and understanding of each other, but I'm still missing the element of faith also as sort of something that will always be irrational. You seem to want to do away with that element of faith where the ultimate claims of different religions will never be proven definitively, the truth of one versus the other, and they do contradict each other. And the reason for commitment to a particular religious tradition has to do with this attitude of faith. So that's one element. Where is the element of faith in your discourse?
Can I just take that question first? Because you're going to then probably give another question, and then it's going to be hard for me to address both. I actually think about it as you can suspect, in the opposite term. First, let me say what it is that binds people to their traditions is precisely something for which they can actually understand or provide good reasons. What I mean by that is, and I don't doubt that faith is an element, but what binds people to their traditions, and here we can think about, again, the scriptural traditions, if you will, is exactly what I suggested, that scriptural traditions are traditions that accrue wisdom. What do I mean by wisdom? So we can think about wisdom in Gadamerrian terms, where Gadamer understands, if you will, what is it that makes something a classic? Well, in part, what makes something a classic is that it offers us the opportunity to think it through over time, render it intelligible. It continues to be rendered intelligible in a way that it's something that over time informs how we live, informs our habits, and that those habits are continually reinforced by our understanding of these texts. And the text gains our commitment, and the tradition gains our commitment, the more it midwives us and continues to support us in the project of answering primary human questions about how it is that we live and how it is that we can operate in a way in the created order to make this created order an inhabitable environment. That is a remarkable grounds for normative commitment. It's clear to me that the condition of the possibility, I just want to say, it's clear to me that religious traditions will continue to exist, and it's a point that can be argued. But I'm going to strongly suggest that religious traditions continue to exist because they do make normative claims on people. That is to say that they're not lifestyles, that they're not things that people willy-nilly say, today I'm going to do half of it, tomorrow I'm going to do the other half of it. You have to have real normative commitment in order to be able to explain to your children why it is that over time they should continue to act. A religious tradition that thereby provides the opportunity, ongoing opportunity, to make successful normative claims. That is to say, a normative claim that makes sense, a normative claim that doesn't make sense, that is simply a product of what I call amour. That is to say, something that we can't actually give language for, amour that we can't say, here's what this claim is, and it's not this claim, is not going to lend itself to longevity or continuity. By contrast, a tradition that does invite its practitioners to think about that tradition, to relate that tradition to other things that we know about the world, is precisely a tradition that will ground obligation to it.
Yeah, and that's why these traditions have existed for such a long time.
Correct, exactly.
And why they haven't gone away
Exactly.
after the encounter with other religious traditions.
Absolutely.
So it's not like there's a radical discontinuity between ultimate claims of validity and rational reflection on those ultimate claims, but the claims themselves remain ultimate for the tradition themselves and incompatible across religious traditions.
So
how
I
do
hear
we deal with
I hear your point. The only distinction that I would make, and I see your point. The only distinction that I would make is as to what is the status, what is the rivalrous status of that appeal to absolute claims? Yes, each tradition has certain claims that have stood the test of time over time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their epistemic value is one that we should confidently and without question say is an absolute validity. It may be the case that for that particular tradition, again, these claims have stood the test of time, but I would suggest that those claims too, just as Strauss suggested that natural sciences presuppositions also need to be potentially subject to falsification. If those claims are not potentially subject to falsification, if they arguably perpetually thwart the opportunity for falsification, then I think that they will actually, over time, undermine themselves. As you yourself said, and I think you're 100% right, it's precisely when those claims actually do stand the test of time. That's their demonstration of their value and their worth, and that's precisely why people sustain their commitment to them. That is not the same as saying that they inevitably will always be and that they are epistemically untouchable. And I do think that it is epistemic hubris on the part of human beings to be sure, to claim absolute certainty that what we deem to be these absolute claims will never, and again, even Novak recognizes that eschatologically, we can't know, and Novak is quite clear about that. It may be the case that for Jews, what we take to be the halakhic worldview, come an eschatological determination, may not actually even be how things are.
But is it not possible to hold an absolute claim with an epistemic humility? So this is what I believe.
Yes.
To be absolutely
Agreed.
true.
I couldn't agree more. And then the question becomes, I couldn't agree more, but then the question becomes, and I think this is where the hard work is, and this is the kind of set of entailments I'm trying to identify. It's one thing to say we can hold an absolute claim with epistemic humility, and it's another thing to say, let's take a look at what that actually looks like. What does that actually look like? What are those conditions of epistemic humility? And my argument is that epistemic humility is a wonderful thing because it permits us to actually begin to avail ourselves potentially of what could be the fruits of other modes of discourse, whether that's natural science or economics or political science or Islam or Buddhism. That's exactly the argument, and in effect, I'm just trying to. I think that sentimentally, many of us want to say exactly what you just said, and I'm challenging us to take a look at what that actually means and why that could be a marvelous, wonderful thing.
Let's go to Dan. A question from Zoom.
Oh, Zoom.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Zoom, from Mark Nanos, actually, for Randi. I wonder if you can explain why you, or someone such as myself, who's speaking, this is Mark speaking, who finds themselves in agreement with what you've explained, why one would resonate with this perspective. Is there some kind of philosophical or other disposition that might help explain a positive or negative reaction to the reasoning you provide?
That's
I
really
think
interesting. That's a great question. That's a William James question, because William James talks about epistemic positions as dispositions. And there are some people who have a kind of natural scientific disposition or a melancholy disposition, so on and so forth. Yeah, I think that I guess what I'm trying to it's a great question. I think that I don't often function on the level of answering questions about dispositions. I think that the way that I operate is by operating on the level of problems and how we solve problems. And I think that the reason why I use that discourse is because I think that no matter what your disposition is, everybody knows that there's climate change as a problem. Everybody knows that there is war as a problem. Everybody knows that that dying too early from certain health conditions is a problem. We don't need to vary to discern different dispositions in order to recognize things that by point blank we all absolutely share. And that is the anxiety that we're going going to have a world to offer to our children that is going to be inhabitable. So that would be my answer to the question, and that's always my response to positions that I call more ideological, or positions that seem to retreat into certainty when there's no question about the fact that, as Marianne's beautiful paper yesterday suggested, we know that if we look at historiography or the way that Peter recognizes it too, there are normal conditions and there are crisis conditions, and under crisis conditions, surely people are going to be more gravitating toward rivalrous positions, so on and so forth. There's a whole host of sociological, political, and economic conditions that lend themselves to having different epistemic positions. But again, I think under all of those circumstances, we all want our children to have a world that they can inherit, or at least a critical mass of us want us to have a world that our children can inherit. So I think dispositions can be something that are kind of put on the sideline and when problems are illuminated.
I want to give Kendall a chance. A reminder that this is a conversation of both papers at this point also.
Yeah, even I can't remember my paper at this point. So that's.
I do. I remember.
That's
your
all right.
paper.
So Randy, here's my thoughts at this point. So it seems to me you give us two options on offer. One option is we have absolute truth claims, and that word absolute comes up a lot, for which one doesn't give reasons, and these are in conflict. And the other is fallible truth claims, fundamental claims, axiomatic claims, for which one nevertheless gives reasons, and here's a key word, and which grounds our commitment to those truth claims. And you use the word grounds. So I'm going to hold you to that for the second. I wouldn't accept either one of those. So I don't like the idea of absolute truth claims for which one doesn't give reasons. I also not 100% convinced that that's actually what David means. And I'm also not want to go with reason giving that grounds one's commitment. I think there's another possibility, and that is commitments that are thoroughly reason giving, but which are held not on the basis of one's ability to give demonstrably convincing reasons, but on the grounds of faith, traditionally understood. So Thomas Aquinas affirms axioms of faith are self-evident, but not to us. So we'll see their self-evidence in time, but we can still reason from them. We can give reasons for them. We can show why arguments against them fail, and we can show why there are good arguments in favor of them without finally being able to ground that. So that is a position that seems to me is an option between the two you give us. It seems to me that in terms of Hans Frey's 5 positions, you're putting David in the position of the fittest on one extreme, and you're advocating for position 4 or 5 with Pannenberg or Kant or Gordon Kaufman. But there are 2 other positions, and those are where Karl Barth falls and where Schleiermacher falls. And it seems to me those give other options.
Well,
Speak into the microphone.
There's a lot to be said in response. My first response is that when you characterize my position as one best described by absolute claims which are grounded in reason and so forth. Yeah, I do. I mean, on that point, we just disagree, I think we just absolutely disagree. I think that the normativity of claims is dependent upon their intelligibility. I do think that if we can't render our claims about revelation intelligible, I do think they will die.
No,
I think if we don't...
But I agree with you about that. But the effort to render intelligible is different from claiming that reason given is the basis on which the reason is held, or the position is held.
My argument is not that, and I didn't have time, and I appreciate the question. My argument is not that, and I said it in the paper, but did not expand upon it. Is that intelligibility is surely not the only criterion by means of which these claims have worth or merit, and thereby could, in effect, catalyze obligation. I do think that the intelligibility and the capacity to give reasons is a minimal condition of their normative obligatory status. I believe it's a minimal condition, without which I think these traditions will ultimately become diluted and lose adherence. It's a minimal, not an exhaustive, maximal condition. So I'm definitely, with respect to, that in a nutshell is my position. With regard to David, all I can say is that, I've gone through David's entire corpus of work. I know David's reasoning patterns very, very well. I love David very, very dearly. David is of the persuasion, like Soloveitchik, that reasoning patterns transpire internally only within the absolute presuppositions of a tradition, and therefore that's exactly Soloveitchik's reasoning for why, according to Soloveitchik wrote a very famous article called Confrontation. And it's noteworthy that the name of the article is Confrontation because it describes precisely the relation between Jews and Christians. And this was a revolutionary essay by Soloveitchik at this time that we're all referring to as such a critical time of Jewish-Christian relations. But Soloveitchik basically argues, and in a lot of respects, Novak is a child of Soloveitchik here in his model, that Jews and Christians can't talk about the fundamental claims. They cannot exchange about these fundamental revelatory commitments because God speaks to each in a language that is singularly incommensurate to the other. Thus, it is, according to Soloveitchik, fortunately, and here he is similar to David, there are things that Jews and Christians can talk about because both of them admit there is some degree of natural law. Whether you're Soloveitchik, maybe less natural law, if you're Novak, more natural law, but both think that there is natural law. But natural law does not undermine the fact that both really maintain that reasoning, by and large, happens internally. So for David, reasoning is going to happen in terms of rabbinic reasoning. Reasoning happens in response to what he calls the data of revelation. It's a very common 20th century view coming out of Jewish Orthodox thinking, halacha, philosophy of law, so on and so forth. But what it won't concede is the possibility that reasoning can actually happen outside of these traditions as well. The difference between my position and what I call the rational enlightenment position is, of course, the Kant-Mendelssohn model is the model that presupposes a certain monological view of what counts as reasoning. That kind of position, a monological understanding of reasoning, falls exactly prey to Strauss's view of the Enlightenment. That is, there we also have an account of reasoning, and this is a critique of Kant, that Kant has a monolithic account of what constitutes reasoning, and it goes hand in hand with his account of what constitutes Newtonian science, and from there he won't budge. And that too is going to put limits, despite Kant's own interest, on the pursuit of inquiry over time. And so, again, what I'm ultimately suggesting is that the good news is that Jews and Christians cannot, yes, even from a Barthian perspective, the difference between Barth and this position, and I did all of my work on Barth for a very long time, but the difference here is that, and I think partly what I'm describing here is a difference between Judaism and Christianity writ large. Barth ultimately argues that human beings that God is wholly other, and human beings cannot actually speak about, despite the fact that Barth's work changes in church dogmatics, there's always the shadow of the nine. And the nine is always there, saying that human discourse is limited, human discourse is always subject to error, so on and so forth. From the Jewish perspective, discourse can be finite, discourse can be fallible, discourse can be wrong, and discourse and the possibility of engaging in ongoing interpretation of our text and our world is something that we can still go ahead and do, precisely because we've got modes of being able to discern truth and fallibility, and we are able in the position to make a determination, not a permanent determination, an ongoing determination of what counts as the validity validity or veracity of our claims. Barth has a tendency, I mean, in the church dogmatics, he gives more understanding of analogia fide and so on and so forth. He opens up more doors to how Christian dogmatics can have justification to speak and on what grounds. But from my perspective, it's still a slippery slope, and there's still enormous doubt, more doubt than even I want to suggest with regard to human claims.
Okay. Avi, are you still? Okay.
I'm just interested in the word faith here. It seems to me that right in the liturgy, emet ve'emunah, we distinguish between truth claims and aspiration to truth and faith. So faith is something a little bit different. And I just wonder whether something like the word confidence, which is more practical and generated in the course of a Jewish praxis, should be associated with faith.
Nice point. I'm happy to, but I don't have to. I've spoken so much. I'm happy to. There's a well-known Jewish theologian and rabbinic scholar named Eliezer Berkovitz, who helps us to appreciate that, first of all, yes, we don't often use the language of faith per se in Judaism, but that determination of the wisdom of the tradition is one that accrues over time. The vitality of the tradition, as to the extent that it continues to foster our ability to promote human flourishing, is precisely what continues to develop into the community's understanding of confidence in the tradition, and that. I mean, again, we see that again. You know, the hackneyed claim that the rabbis say the Torah is not in heaven. The Torah is for us. It's not only to us, but it's for us, and it's not only for us, it is to us, and it's in our hands. And yes, our confidence in it accrues over time. I do think that is more akin to at least the philosophical project I'm laying out.
And we have the legacy of Mendelssohn. We have the legacy of Mendelssohn to encourage us to minimize the number of truth claims that actually we want to endorse as absolute and eternal, and put our confidence in the ongoing evolution of practices.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you read Jerusalem, I couldn't agree more. Mendelssohn is encouraging Jews and Christians to cultivate education and learning, and Mendelssohn precisely argues that that actually is necessary for an Enlightenment society that tends to register dogmatic positions about reason. Yeah, it is. It is positioned on some level of Bildung, of cultivation, curricular, ongoing cultivation.
And also phronesis. There's phronesis here,
Yes.
which gets into the question of ineffability and intelligibility, and I don't want to take us there, but.
Yeah, let's go to Elena.
Thank you. I just have actually a question on the practical consequences of what I think. Let's check if I got it right. So in the three phases that you highlighted, if we go to the pragmatic one, which I think is the one where you would like to, or where I think you see the fruitful dimension of it, you were saying it presupposes the fallibility of revelatory claims. I heard you saying this really this presupposes, which I find very interesting. And I'm wondering, and I go back actually to what Kendall was mentioning earlier when he was talking about the risk of the us-them dimension, and when you were saying, the risk that I heard you verbalizing is that it goes to a fictive other, right? And I'm wondering how do we engage? What happens with those who are not really going in that direction of fallibility of revelatory claims? How do we go to this? Or if it's not this pragmatic phase, which I would say actually that there is space. I don't think that it really going to a pragmatic phase in relationship, I wouldn't be sure that it really needs to presuppose the fallibility. But what happens practically? I mean, how do we engage with those who don't go in that direction, or are they out of the picture, or who are those people? Who are those communities? Who are those individuals that you're having in mind in this pragmatic phase?
I see. Well, it's a very good question. There's a number of different ways to respond. I think your question is, who the hell's going to do this? Who does this? Isn't it the case that most folks will function in an ideological way?
Also, what do we do with those who don't?
And what do we do with what?
What do we do with those who don't agree with this presupposition?
I think what I'm trying to do here is I'm not trying to, in effect, I'm actually not, though it may sound this way, I'm not trying to be prescriptive about what I think ought to be the case. I'm trying to illuminate what I think are the outcomes and the entailments of sustaining certain models of reasoning with respect to Jewish-Christian relations. I'm trying to illuminate what I think, and in effect, the message that I'm giving is that unless Jewish-Christian relations is somehow philosophically capable of overcoming the philosophical noose of supersessionism, that it will ultimately sustain a rivalry between the two positions. And I ultimately don't think that rivalry, it can be mollified, it can be softened, it can be tamed, it can be limited, but I think it still will always be there. Then somebody might say in response, well, it's always going to be there. And my point is that if it's always going to be there, that will ultimately be philosophically a testament to how these traditions will undo themselves over time. I do not think that traditions that insist upon a rivalrous, a potentially deadly, polemical, rivalrous position will stand the test of time. I do not think that they are sources of wisdom, and I don't think that they will stand the test of time. Again, I do think they can stand the test of a good chunk of time. Ideology lasts for a long time. And again, as I mentioned in the paper, ideologues have a terrific ability. They have a wonderful toolbox. And I'm not just talking about ideologues out there. We all have ideological, epistemological tendencies. But what I'm trying to do is shed light on what I consider to be the philosophical entailments of that position, which I do think will ultimately, the way to understand it is that even the tyrant, really, even tyrants who tend to be ideological would really prefer it if their subjects could endorse their position on some kind of rational ground rather than have to be coercively pushed into that position. Even a tyrant will probably over time, yes, are there certain tyrants who can forestall revolutions? Sure, they can. But ultimately, long run, I'm arguing that I think that it's likely that the inability to offer intelligible claims will mean either a world of rivalry where people are always this close to destroying each other, which is pretty much where we are, or then there is this other philosophical option.
But a good question actually there is just that you're making a direct link between the infallibility of revelatory claims and the rivalry, and that's exactly where, I think this is something that we might question.
Because I think that the argument that a claim is infallible sounds to me like I don't have to provide an account of it to you, and it also sounds to me like I think my claim is infallible, my claim is valid, your claim is not valid. Yeah. That's what supersessionism is. Supersession philosophically is the position. Christianity has for centuries argued that Judaism is invalid as a position, period, invalid, and that Christianity is the only sole principle of salvation. And I'm suggesting that does not bode well for Christianity.
Kendall, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, there are a kind of a range of issues where I think I disagree a little bit. It seems to me that and just to cut to the chase, I do think there is such a thing as holy rivalry. I think there are good examples of that in scriptural sources. I think that some rivalries go wrong and are deadly, but I think some rivalries actually serve life in the long run and ultimately. I also think that the nature of disagreement between differing traditions exists not only at the maximal level of ultimate truth claims, but at also more prosaic, pedestrian level of conflicting plain sense claims. So was Jesus crucified? That's a claim where scriptural traditions between Islam and Christianity. You could argue we're not talking about the Trinity. We're talking about the outcome of a particular Friday afternoon. Both traditions can give reasons, and I think reason giving is important. But I don't think that reason giving is ever going to arrive at a point at which now Islam says, oh, he was crucified. Or Christians say, oh, he wasn't crucified, I see now. The reason giving will serve other rational purposes. It will tame the rivalry. It will develop respect, et cetera, et cetera. But that irritation in the relationship is not going to go away, no matter how many reasons are given. Then the question becomes, I think we have to live with that outcome. Is that always going to be deadly? Well, I don't know that it has to be. I think that's where the discipline of the kind of reasons we give, the way we give them, the way we receive them, can serve life. So yes to reason giving, no to the idea that they all exist at this level, and no to the idea that they're always going to be deadly. Rivalry is always going to be deadly.
Okay, I have a long list of names at this point. If there was another person from Zoom.
I want to try to synthesize a few questions from Zoom that I think are coming around here, which is essentially, from Randy's perspective, what then you're working at kind of these fundamental levels, but then what from your perspective would be possible for Judaism to say about Christianity and its own claims, as that maybe also sits alongside other claims of other religions, not necessarily just Christianity? Because as noted, Judaism is really just having a different approach to the question of religious diversity than the Christian-Jewish, or the Christian perspective about Judaism.
Are you asking me on a thematic level, or are you asking me on a logical level? I'm not sure.
I think more thematically, like what then are the implications from your perspective of these approaches might begin to be said from a Jewish perspective about other religious traditions? Well, I'm trying to synthesize a few questions here as well. Yeah.
I mean, Judaism stands in an interesting position with respect to what it says about other religious traditions on the grounds of the fact that its structure of covenant relation with God and its structure of covenant relation with the whole human family means that Judaism stands. Let me say it this way: it stands in maybe the good position of not needing to say very much about other traditions, perhaps being open. I mean, there's nothing, as Jewish scholars will say, there's nothing about the Jewish covenant that God establishes with the Jews that prohibits the possibility that God established a different covenant relationship with other people. Already there's the Noahide covenant, and God does establish covenantal relations. Whether any of that means that Jews feel like they are in a privileged position to be able to say anything about these traditions, I don't think that Judaism feels that it's in a privileged position. again, Judaism's, what it feels that it's been able to say about something like Christianity, whether it claims that Christianity was paganism and so forth, has changed over the course of time. But so, again, the good news is that I would argue that structurally it's in a position where it doesn't have a desire to say that much about these other traditions. It doesn't see itself as privileged with respect to them. On the other hand, as a good buddy of mine, Leora Benitsky, will point out, and I think she's right about this, where Judaism does suffer a problem, and it's a problem that does need to be changed, and it's one that I think that we've been working on, is that it suffers it's the same scenario, but the problem that arises, which is indifference. There's an extent to which Judaism maintains an indifference to other religious traditions. And so I think it's important for Judaism. Judaism is ready-made with a very fruitful conception of creation, which really ought to invite it to appreciate that the notion of being a guardian over God's created order means, and this is precisely why Soloveitchik recognizes this. Soloveitchik knows that while he argues that while Jews and Christians can't talk about each other's revelatory tradition, we can talk about how to improve farming. We can talk about how to improve healthcare. We can talk about how to improve climate change. We can actually, so whether that's saying something about other religious traditions, I think it's more akin to doing something with other religious traditions, which I think is probably how I would go on that question. I feel like this was like Miss America.
Yes.
Like, thank you. They'll be the.
This is actually a question for Dr. Soulen. I was part of a conversation last week, small group, not an academic conference, but more closer to advocacy. And one of the Jewish participants was working on a concept of allyship. And your presentation made me raise some questions for me about that, which was why.
Which was what? I'm sorry.
Why?
Why?
Why allyship? Why should Christians make efforts to be allies with Jew? Now, on a practical level, that's not a question for me, but it certainly seems to be a question for many of my colleagues, pastor colleagues. And I was wondering if the impetus for an I-thou relationship, if it requires a mandate from the us-them relationship. Mm-hmm. If the need for me to associate with the rabbi in my town or the next town in a position of allyship to develop an I-thou relationship requires a sense that Christians owe that to Jews for theological, historical, sociological reasons, and whether that then inherently becomes an asymmetrical relationship.
Yeah, if I understand you, I think part of the asymmetry is that Christians feel there are a lot of reasons coming from a lot of directions that lead people who are Christ followers to think that they have a profound internal link to the Jewish people, not just to biblical Israel, but to a people that continues to exist today in continuity with biblical Israel. That intimacy doesn't always bear good fruit. The sense that one's intimately related to somebody can go wrong in all sorts of ways. So, but the fact that intimate sense of connection is there, it seems to me, goes very deep, and it's inexpungible. You cannot get rid of it. There was an interesting review that was written by the rabbi of, help me, at Yale, the rabbi, the great, that's not quite right, but anyway, it was reviewing Paul Van Buren's book and he basically said this is all ideal, but it all presupposes Christians are going to change their spots. You know, the leopard's not going to change its spots. And so this sense of intrinsic identity is going to, it seems to me, be there. So then the question is, yeah, to tame it. From the Jewish point of view, it's not reciprocated in the same way. That's just, that's just there. The indifference, that applies to other religions, to some degree applies to Christianity too. It's not reciprocated. That doesn't mean that that difference can't be lived into on both sides in a way that's life-giving for both traditions. And there are all sorts of different reasons that motivate finding that common ground. All sorts of different reasons. So even Soloveitchik wanted them on his own terms. So I don't know if that addresses the question at all.
Not quite.
Okay.
I can see that certainly your local pastor is really what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
Has plenty of reasons, scriptural, theological, to think a lot about Jews and Judaism, at least in their own misdirected concept of what Jews and Judaism are. But that doesn't seem to impel them to go down the street and to spend a lot of time with the local rabbi to develop that I-thou relationship. And so I'm wondering, and I'm speaking very practically now.
Well, no, that's where I think, if I may, that's where the changes in the us-them relationship. Judaism is not a dead religion. The covenant relationship is not over. Those are misunderstandings that contradict our scripture. So then the posture that the us-them conversation, all of a sudden I look at the Jewish person down the street and I see somebody who's in a living relationship with God, remains God's covenant people. That changes and provides a motivation for why I, as a Christian, want to have a relationship. So yes, there are ways in which those us-them changes lead directly to, have pragmatic consequences that channel into a desire to form I-thou relationships that wasn't there previously. And so yes, to that.
I think this conversation can go on for a very, very long time. I've been biting my tongue with all the things that I want to say, and I know that Peter wanted to speak also, and we will have to do that informally over lunch. I'm not sure whether lunch is totally ready yet or not, but I can smell it. But that's our next stage, and we reconvene at 1 o'clock for the next session for Adam's paper.